Hey everybody, I'm Dan Jackson, also known as Dan's the Engineer. Welcome to another video and to my channel. This video is a Q&A about domestic smoke alarms, so domestic fire alarm systems. I put out a post on my social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, even on the Sparky Ninja Facebook group. Check it out if you haven't checked it out already. And basically I'm asking people to put their questions in and I'll answer it for this Q&A. So I've put together 10 questions that so many people responded to this. It's really good actually, because I'm so grateful for anybody who watches my channel, engages with me. We all learn from each other. This channel wouldn't be here without people watching, and I'm always grateful when people like, people share it, people comment, because it helps me get my message out as well. So anyway, let's get straight into this because I have a feeling some of these are going to be quite lengthy. So the 10 questions are: what is best, hardwired or radio interlinked smoke alarms? When is a grade A commercial fire alarm required in a domestic property? Can you install domestic smoke alarms in a commercial premises? Should you interlink a carbon monoxide detector with smoke alarms? Where can you fit detectors? Should we measure the sound levels on a domestic system? How do you interlink a domestic smoke alarm system with a sprinkler system? What certification is required for installing domestic smoke alarm systems? Can you mix different brands of smoke alarms? And do HMOs need fire alarm systems? So we go straight into question one. What is best, hardwired or radio interlinked smoke alarms? Now loads of people ask this question, by the way. It's like the main asked question. So Ben Salvage on, I believe this is on LinkedIn, who's a JIB approved electrician. Maybe talk about the benefits of wireless linked over hardwired and techniques for connections, i.e. dedicated circuit or connecting into lighting. And I believe this one was on YouTube by Ryan Atkins. Hi Dan, quick question. When wiring a smoke alarm, would you put it on its own circuit or would you come off the lighting circuit? Thanks. So if we go straight to the British standard for domestic smoke alarm systems, which is BS 5839 Part 6. Now I honestly believe that you should not be installing these systems at all whatsoever. Even if you're an electrician, you've got your electrical qualifications, I don't believe you should be installing these systems unless you've got this document and you've read it and you understand it. Now, it is a bit of a pain because it does cost quite a lot of money, but you can often get a package if you're with NAPIT, if you're with the ECA, the SSAIB, there are others out there as well, where you can get sort of a BSI license. 15.4. Recommendations for power supplies for grade D system. A grade D is a mains smoke detector or smoke alarm system or heat detector. So we've got two options. We can either install an independent circuit at the dwelling's consumer unit, in which case no other electrical equipment should be connected to this circuit. So it's a completely independent, dedicated circuit. We've got nothing else on it whatsoever. This is what I used to do many, many years ago. We used to go into properties, do rewires, and we have a dedicated circuit. Or a separately electrically protected, regularly used local lighting circuit, in which case there should be means for isolation of the smoke alarms from the lighting circuit, i.e. for maintenance. So what we're saying here is we can come off the local lighting. So it doesn't mean if you've got a 2-story building, all the smokes can come off the downstairs lighting. It means that you come off the local lighting to that floor or to that area, should I say. And there's sort of some pros and cons about it. I'll try and outlay this, right? So I personally think it is better to install off local lighting and use radio bases, personally. You can use a combination of both. So if you're doing, it's an existing property and, you've got to sum up, what is best at the time. But I think coming off the local lighting is better because tenants are less likely to turn off the lighting circuit, whereas, I've done so many call-outs going to, where it's a dedicated smoke alarm circuit where it's been down powered, they've gone away for holiday, turn the power off for the smoke alarms for whatever reason, the batteries have died, and obviously it's going to be costly for the landlord or tenants or whoever's paying. So I think, I personally, my own home would come off the local lighting for each detector and have radio bases. The technology is really good these days, and there's not much need to install a dedicated circuit. Now, the other thing is as well that if you have got permanent line of neutrals at lighting throughout a property, there is less wiring, because generally you just come off the local lighting, there's less cabling involved. So if you're working for a client, obviously, a bit of a bonus there is that there's less making good. So when I do a survey, part of the survey is to make sure that the local lighting has a permanent line of neutral, otherwise you're banjaxed from the beginning, basically. But, at the same time, there's benefits of installing a dedicated circuit. It means that nothing else can come off it. It means it's not going to be disrupted. So, I'm not too fussed, but if I was designing a system, I tend to, in an existing build, I would tend to go for coming off local lighting. So that's just me. It's personal choice. Now, if you weigh up costs, I actually think it can be cheaper actually doing radio detectors coming off local lighting a lot of the time, because of the less making good. So even though our costs will be slightly more if you do a comparative, but the way you can sell it to your client is that then there's less making good, they haven't got to get somebody else in, there's less disruption, usually the works are quicker. It's personal preference, but I like to do price comparisons and give the clients options basically when I do quotes. Right, so the next question is, when is a grade A commercial fire alarm required in a domestic property? This is something I get asked all the time. Now, this question was by Stuart Cato of Cato Electrical Services. Now, me and Stuart have spoken about this before. So he has said, I think the difference between domestic systems, depending on the size of the property, the amount of large properties you see with a basic fire alarm system. Now, what he's on about is, at what point do you go from your grade D or grade F smoke detectors, the typical domestic smoke detectors, to a full commercial fire alarm panel system, loop cabling, or non-addressable conventional cabling. At what point do you go to that? Now, it's quite clear in the British standards, but sometimes architects, or if somebody has an input into the design of a system, this is where it can be a little bit clouded. And bear in mind, I hate using this word, but the standards are a guide, but providing you have sufficient knowledge and competence to design a system outside of the standards, and you have reasons to justify and mitigate some of the points raised, I think that's fine. But generally speaking, I think we should stick to the British standards. So Part 1 versus Part 6. Now, Part 1 of BS 5839 is commercial, which we'll go through in a second actually. And Part 6 is dwellings, it's domestic situations. So what we have to bear in mind is that what Part 6 covers. So when you go to a British standard, you can go to the scope. What does it cover? What does it not cover? It will tell you. So Part 6 covers the design, installation, commissioning and maintenance of domestic systems, single family premises, flats and multi-storey, HMOs with a number of self-contained units, sheltered housing, dwellings and common areas, supported housing, self-catering holiday homes. So basically it's where you live. It's quite simple. It's where you live. Now, what it doesn't include, now this is the interesting bit, it doesn't include non-domestic premises, which is quite obvious, hostels, caravans and boats, and communal parts of blocks of flats or masonettes. That is really important here. So if you've got a purposeful block of flats, the communal areas come under Part 1, not Part 6. They're different. So when someone's trying to apply Part 6 to a communal parts of a purpose-built block of flats, it's not quite right. But it's quite complicated, so I'm not going to go too much into that detail right now. But what we do is, when we're looking at what type of system on, in any premises, any domestic premises, and Stuart's obviously on about, you might have like a 4-storey or 3-storey really large building, because that's something him and I have spoken about before. Now what you do is you go to Table 1 in the British Standards. Get the British Standards, guys. Table 1 outlines exactly what grade is recommended, what category, and that's for whether it's an existing premises or it's a new or a materially altered buildings, such as a full refurb, or if you're going through building regulations. So there's a table here that lists all the different types of buildings, and the grade is the type of detection. So grade A is your full flow fire alarm panel devices, and then typically we've got a grade D, which is your main smoke detectors with battery backup, and then we've got a grade F, which is just your fire angels that you might get in Tesco's, and there are other obviously systems out there, but they're just the battery only detectors. There's different grades, and it runs through which is which, and obviously it depends on risk. This has been assigned depend on risk, and then the category is a level of detection. I'm not going to go into level of detection right now. This table outlines and recommends exactly what should go where depending on the size of the property. So if we zoom in a little bit more on this, so if we've got a single family dwelling and shared houses with no floor greater than 200 meters squared, which 200 meters squared for a floor is pretty big, really. The average house is not that size. And it runs through, which ones are grade A, which is a commercial fire alarm system and panel, in answer to Stuart's question here. So I've listed on here which types of premises require a grade A fire alarm system, and obviously if you can look at the table, it depends if it's existing or if it's a new build. So this table tells us exactly where. So you go through table 1. We're not going to go through in too much detail because if you want a video on this, let me know and we can do. What you do is when you've got a system that requires a grade A fire alarm system, you are installing that system to part 1. This is the important thing. So if a grade A system is specified, you install that system in that premises to part 1, fire alarm panel and everything else. However, there's a little list here that lets you swap clauses. So for example, in part 1, on clause 16, audible alarm signals, you don't use part 1, clause 16, use part 6, clause 13, and so on. And I hope that makes sense. A good example is manual call points. So it's not required to install manual call points in the same way as it is on part 1 in a domestic premises. It's a recommendation in certain areas. Just an example, the capacity of the standby batteries. You'll be surprised actually in a domestic premises you have to install quite big batteries and battery backup. So be careful on that. Don't just install a twin flex system and think whatever batteries come with it are absolutely fine. You need to do battery calculations, and you don't use clause 25.4e on part 1. Use 15.2c on part 6. I hope that makes sense. If you want more clarity on this is something, to be honest, I could talk an hour about this particular topic. If you want that, let me know. I'll obviously consider it. So the next question is, can you install a domestic smoke alarm in a small commercial premises? Now this is by Robert Edmonds, which I think was on LinkedIn. Hi Dan, I recently had to pick up something from a new shop that was being fitted out. Nothing to do with electrical. When walking around, I noticed that the shop had domestic smoke detectors installed. I know the shop owner and mentioned that the smoke detectors may be wrong, but not entirely sure. Can you confirm whether these are allowed, and if so, can you explain how? There's a flat above the shop. I've been told by the contractor that they are allowed. The install has been signed off by building control. Right, okay, so we need to go back to part 6 on this one. Can we install domestic smoke detectors in a part 1 system? Now, if we go back to our slide on what part 6 does not cover, it does not cover non-domestic premises. And vice versa, the part 1 obviously doesn't allow the use of domestic smoke alarms. And what we'll go through on part 1 clause 11, system components, this clause basically lays out the product standard for what detectors can be installed and how they're manufactured. So each detector has to be installed to a standard, okay? And this clause outlines what detectors can be used within part 1. So commercial premises fall under part 1, not part 6. And in a nutshell, domestic smoke detectors are not approved for part 1 systems in part 1 premises. And if we go to part 6 here, we can see that there are there are some, you're allowed commercial detectors and alarms to be used in Part 6, but generally not the way around. And what we're looking at is smoke alarms should conform to BSEN 14604. Now, that's your typical domestic smoke alarm. Now, so commercial premises and the whole standard of Part 1 does not allow the use of domestic smoke detectors. I see it quite often, and years ago, when I used to do a lot of shop fitting in petrol stations, for example, it was a requirement to install like just a main smoke detector, whatever it was, in the shop, and that was it. And obviously that's a commercial premises. Now, going back to the communal blocks of flats, not if it's a large block of flats, but if it was like a masonette and you had a corridor, as such, like a ground floor and a landing, I don't see there being a problem personally with a domestic smoke alarm system, provided it's interlinked and it meets a fire risk assessment and everything else within that property, if it is a real basic property. But I don't see the issue with that, providing that someone's happy to sign a design document. And bear in mind, we have to install things knowing that if a fire occurs, we're installing it to save somebody's life. When you're installing fire alarm systems, you have to be able to stand in front of a judge. If something went wrong, put your hand up and say, I've done everything I possibly can to make sure that what I'm installing is to British standards, to guidance and everything else. Because we're installing these systems to save lives, and these standards have been created for that reason, essentially. So when we depart from the standards, we have to have a good enough justification and be able to take accountability if something does go wrong. If you're not comfortable to be in that position, don't depart from the standards or seek advice from somebody else. So can you install domestic smoke alarms in commercial premises? I think as an installer, as an electrician, my advice to you is to seek guidance from a fire risk assessor and just speak with them, work with them and say, look, this is the building, is this suitable? They might turn around and say, no chance, not whatsoever, because it's a fire risk assessor's job to make sure that, well, they're assessing a risk and to look at the requirements of what's needed for the level of risk. So sometimes I don't think it's down to you as the installer to make that judgment. But just bear in mind, if you're installing life safety systems, there are people who have gone to prison, there's people who have been fined, because there are deaths, people do die. And not only that, there might be property damage, people are looking to sue and blame. It's a massive blame game. So it's about keeping yourself outside of that box and having everything in order to make sure that you can turn around and say, nah, not me, mate, not me. So the next question is question 4. Should you interlink a carbon monoxide detector with smoke alarms? Now, this was asked on Twitter by Switchlek. Interlinking smoke and CO is something that's always worth brushing up on. Now, this is the age-old question that, I'm getting more and more of, to be honest. So let's talk about ACO, right? So you can get ACO carbon monoxide detectors. You can interlink them to the system via radio, hardwired, depending on what model you get, or you can keep them standalone. Now, BS 5839 Part 6 has no requirement for you to link a carbon monoxide detector if the carbon monoxide detector is being used for detecting, obviously, carbon monoxide, where there's a solid fuel burning appliance, obviously, bear in mind, I am referring to England a lot of the time here as well, because the regulations in Scotland are a little bit different and they do vary around the country. But generally speaking, there's no requirement to interlink them. So if we just run through a little bit of a scenario here. So when you've got, say, a gas boiler and it's producing high levels of carbon monoxide that are within the room, obviously we want to alert the users of the building that there's potential poisonous gas in that room, okay? Because it can cause serious illness, it can kill people. It's called the silent killer. You can't see it, you can't smell it. It's there, you can die. So it's important to know that. Now, in England, actually, it's not legislation to ensure that there's there's a smoke detector with a gas boiler. So we've got that scenario. Now, if you obviously interlink it with the smoke alarm system, which you might have a smoke alarm system throughout, obviously if it detects carbon monoxide, it's going to wake you up in the middle of the night, because that's when you're vulnerable, because you're not aware, and therefore it can potentially save your life, it can save you getting ill. Now, there are components, there are parts that you can get on an ecosystem, for example, that you can do an alarm locator. They've got all fancy apps that helps you understand what actually went off, like the carbon monoxide and what have you. But some people argue that it's not a fire, so therefore it shouldn't be set on the firearm. And obviously if the firearm goes off and it keeps going off, you might think there's a fire, you might call the fire brigade. Now, I personally think they should be interlinked. Now, I've been looking up carbon monoxide, and it's something I need to brush up on more. But obviously, carbon monoxide rises with hot air. So if you turn the boiler off, the carbon monoxide drops down and it doesn't really spread. This is what I'm sort of being told. But within particular buildings, if your boiler's on, the hot air is heating up. Obviously, it can travel from room to room. So if you're not interlinking your carbon monoxide, there is a chance it can rise and travel to a different room. And obviously, if that detector is only in, say, the kitchen, and you've got a long corridor or whatever, and your bedroom's at the end, and you're a deep sleeper, or you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or all of it might have been a wild night, then there might be a chance that you won't hear that standalone alarm, because it's quite important that these alarms we hear when we're asleep. So I personally believe you should interlink them. Personally, I would in my own home. But again, in some situations, you might not have to. So yeah. Right, question 5. Now, I knew this would be asked. Now, there's loads of online resources that you can look up here. ACO do fantastic information, they really do. And if you do the expert installer course, it's bang on with where you fit alarms. They've got contractor handy guides. Honestly, guys, use them. So I'm going to try and run through this really, really briefly and outline, because again, it's all in a British standard. It's all pretty black and white. So we're just trying to outline some of this. Otherwise, this video is just going to go on and on and on. So James DCI Net on Twitter has said location and placement would be a good start. The times I see a smoke alarm right next to less than 300mm to a pendant, or see one right at the apex of a vaulted ceiling, not 600mm down. So, right, let's run through some of the basics of where you site. So clause 11 in part 6 tells you exactly where you put detectors and the ins and the outs. So I'm just outlining some of the main points. Detectors should be, where practicable, be mounted on ceilings and should be located at least 300mm horizontally from any wall or light fitting, unless in the case of light fittings there is tested evidence to prove that the proximity of the light fitting will not adversely affect the efficiency of the detector. Good luck with that, by the way. So basically, don't install them closer than 300mm to any walls or any light fittings. In some instances, this is a bit of a pain, because we might have a bit of an awkward shape, and we know the lighting layout takes precedence over the fire alarm detectors. We know this. People don't like these ugly detectors on their ceilings. So you have to be a little bit sensible about it. There are instances where your detector might look a little bit out of line of your lighting layout, because your pendant, for example, might be closer than 300mm to the wall. So we have to be a little bit sensible here, but again, we have to make sure that we're happy with whatever we're installing is going to detect a fire. And I would always go in with, this is the best place to put the detector. How do you feel about that, to the client, and kind of work with them and educate them of why we put them, and we don't butt them up against the wall, which is often you see quite a lot. And think about other obstructions as well. And just to give you an example of hallways, often are quite tricky if they're quite a narrow hallway. And also, we don't want to put we've got to put them in a place where they can be maintained. Like, we don't want to put them over a stair where the tenant, or not the tenant, sorry, the homeowner might need to change the batteries themselves, or we need to service them themselves. We don't want to put them over the stairs that's going to compromise safety and we can't get access to. So we've got to put them in sensible places. It's really important. Ceiling mounted detectors should be located such that their sensitive elements are between 25mm and 150mm below the ceiling in the case of heat detectors, or 25mm to 600mm below the ceiling in case of smoke detectors. So ignore the 25mm, but that's why we don't recess some smoke detectors, because their sensitive elements are below the ceiling as such. So that's why they're quite, proud of the ceiling, if you like. But what we're saying is that they can go up to, smoke detectors can go up to 600mm below the ceiling level, and 150mm for heat detectors. So obviously we put them on the ceiling most of the time, but you might have two levels. So just have a think about that, because you can put it on a higher or the lower level. I think that kind of makes sense. Hopefully it does for you. Where there is a pitched ceiling, detectors should be installed at or not more than 600mm vertically below the apex for smoke detectors, or 150mm for heat detectors. It's pretty much the same thing, but this is saying they should be installed at or not more than. It's a bit of a weird wording, if you ask me. Where you've got an apex of a ceiling, you are advised to install them at the levels we just discussed, so 600mm for smokes and 150mm from heats. It's not saying install them right at the top, it's installing them just below. And that obviously question, that's what the question on Twitter was about. Where structural beams create an obstacle for a flow of smoke across the ceiling. 1. If the depth of the beam is more than 10% of the ceiling height. So for example, if you've got a 2.6 metre high ceiling and you've got a 300mm beam, this is relevant to this. So where the depth is more than 10% of the ceiling height, it should be treated as a wall. So in that case, you treat a beam as the wall, i.e. detector should be provided on both sides of the beam. Okay, but if the beam is less than 600mm in depth, a detector should be installed on the underside of the beam, because obviously we can install detectors from ceiling height all the way down to 600mm, if that makes sense. So if the underside of the beam is 600mm, then we can actually install a detector on the underside of the beam, which means that you don't need two detectors either side. In other cases, detectors should be installed closer to the beam than twice the depth of the beam, or 500mm, whichever is less. I hope that makes sense. So for example, if we've got a 2.6 metre ceiling and we've got a 200mm depth beam, what it's saying here is that the detector should not be installed closer to twice the depth of the beam, so 400mm to the beam, or 500mm, whichever is less. Obviously 400mm is less, so you can install 400mm away from the beam. If ceiling mounting is practicable, should I say, in rooms and hallways, less than 10 metres in both lengths and breadth, and less than 50 metres square in area, detectors may alternatively be mounted on the wall, provided that the top of the detection element is between 150mm and 300mm below the ceiling, and the bottom of the detection element is above level of any door opening, and the manufacturer's instructions state that the detector is suitable for wall mounting. So there's quite a criteria here. So when you see detectors on the wall, sometimes it's okay, but often it isn't. So it might not be British standards, but it might meet the manufacturer's guidance. You have to be a little bit careful here with what you do. So I wouldn't go installing them on walls willy-nilly. You have to really think about this design. This is all in a British standard. Where smoke alarms are installed, no bedroom door should be further than 3 metres from the nearest smoke alarm. Really important one, because in my house, it's a rental property, turn up and the fire angel smoke detector is more than 3 metres away from my bedroom door. So yeah, this is an important one, and it leads on to the next question. Question 6. Should we measure the sound levels on a domestic system? Okay, so this question was by Simon Perrott, who owns the Siam Logbook Company. Clarifying the sound level and where it should be measured on a domestic system would be useful to reduce debate. Obviously, the idea of a smoke alarm going off is to alert the users of the building so they can investigate if there's a fire and vacate the property. It's to get us out. Now, the time we're at our most vulnerable is when we're asleep. We could be under the influence of drugs, alcohol, whatever else. You might have someone who's hard of hearing. So we have to use that knowledge and apply it and use engineering judgment here. So if we go to clause 13 on part 6, audible and firearm devices, it mentions part 1. Part 1 recommends that if an audible alarm is intended to rouse sleeping persons, a sound level of 75 dB ought to be achieved at the bedhead. However, this does not guarantee that every person will be awakened, particularly if they're deaf or hard of hearing or under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So what we do on Part 1 systems in commercial, hotels for example, generally speaking, 75 dB at the bedhead is what we record, and the reading we're looking for, and obviously we design systems to suit. So in domestic is a little bit different. So BSEN 14604, which is the product standard for domestic smoke alarms, requires that the sound output of a smoke alarm may be at least 85 dB at 3 meters. So all these detectors are designed so that at 3 meters, the sound level reading will be 85 dB. Hence the previous statement saying that a smoke detector has to be within 3 meters of a bedroom door. That's the requirement. Most domestic doors attenuate sound by around 20 dB. Greater attenuation can occur in the case of solid doors such as fire doors. It is therefore unlikely that a smoke alarm on, for example, the upstairs landing of a 2-storey house will produce a sound level of 75 dB at the bedhead in each bedroom, particularly if the bedroom doors are shut. Levels of 55 dB to 65 dB are more likely. So this is where it's really grey, if I'm honest, because on one minute we're told that we have to install smoke detectors within 3 meters of the bedroom door, but now we're saying there's actually something stating here that they appreciate and recognise that it's unlikely that you're going to get 75 dB at the bedhead. Now, I'm a very deep sleeper. I've been in buildings when the fire alarm's gone off and I don't wake up, which is obviously a worry. So, yeah, what we're saying is that unless there is within the bedroom a fire alarm sounder or smoke alarm or heat alarm that will give a fire alarm signal whenever fire is detected anywhere in a premises, so not just like locally but anywhere. This is why you need to interlink your alarms. In all category LD systems, the sound pressure level of a fire alarm signal, if measured at the doorway of each bedroom with the door open, should be at least 85 dB, irrespective of where the fire is detected in a premises. So what we're saying is, if there's a fire in the kitchen, we need 85 dB at the bedroom door. Do you need to measure that, Simon? Not really, no, because the detectors are designed at 3 meters to have that reading at the door. So it is a bit of rule of thumb. Now, do I recommend that you measure? Yeah, I do, of course. I mean, because I install Part 1 systems, it's standard. Like we do it all the time. We measure, we produce an as-fitted drawing, and we produce the audible levels and readings as part of the commissioning. I do think you should do it on a domestic system. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it is a good idea because it gives you an idea of what the levels are. And obviously, if there's a change of tenancy and maybe they do have some hearing disability, then at least then we've got the information to go, all right, we need to change this, we need to change that, blah, blah, blah. Now, the other thing is if you're a single installer installing a smoke alarm system, unless you've got like a remote control or you've got an additional alarm that you can actually test with, you test the button and then as soon as you take your finger off, obviously the sound starts stopping. So you can't be in two places at one time, can you? On a practical level here, I think it could be quite difficult, but I do think it's a good idea that you do measure, but we're reading this, it's not actually saying it's a requirement. How do you interlink a domestic smoke alarm system with a sprinkler system? This is question 7. Now, this was asked on Twitter by PFW Electrical, how they interlink with a domestic sprinkler system, something that's not covered in the ACO training. Now, ACO do a product called an EI414. I absolutely bloody love it. I mean, I think the design could be a little bit different for install, but generally speaking, it's a fantastic bit of kit. Now, this is a little drawing that I produced for a client just to give a visual of what needs to be wired for an electrician. They asked me, basically it was an open plan multi-storey home, and they've got a domestic fire alarm system in there, and they have an AOV and they had a sprinkler system. So to meet the fire engineering's recommendations, they had to link the smoke alarm system with the sprinkler system and the AOV with the fire alarm system. The idea being, when a fire is detected, it opens up the AOV to allow smoke out, and also that when the sprinkler system activates because there's a fire, there's an audible alarm. So this is just something that I've sort of produced. So I'm not going to go into fine details of how you do this, literally how you connect it up, but you can use ACO do what's called an EI 414, great bit of kit. It's basically an interface like an input output unit that we'd have on Part 1 systems that you can use. It's radio linked as well. It needs a main supply. Yeah, obviously has battery backup. Now this is something that I sort of slotted together as sort of a visual, and it's very straightforward. I mean, what I recommend in this instance is that you speak to ACO and talk to them. If you look up the literature online, there's examples on this 414 of how to actually connect, and it's really honestly straightforward. And also liaise with the sprinkler company, liaise with the AOV company to ensure that their standards are being met, because for example on a sprinkler system you have to have an audible alarm when the flow switch is activated, and obviously we can do that with this because we can sound the sounders in the house when the sprinklers, I mean in theory what should happen is that the smoke detectors will go off before the sprinkler, because the sprinkler's done on heat opposed to smoke. So but you know, we can interface systems, and there's more things and integrations that we can do. All this fancy kit's coming out. Question 8, what certification is required for installing smoke alarm systems? Now I get questions literally daily about this. People saying, you know, what certification do I use to install smoke alarms and what have you. So this was actually on YouTube by Mr. G and Mr. G. Details about certification would be good. We would generally certify the installation, the fixed wiring, but certification of the actual alarm system would be interesting to cover, and the requirements and regulations of doing so. Right, okay, so we've got two things here. So when we install a smoke detector, we should be issuing electrical certification, whether it's a minor works or electrical installation certificate. So if it's a new installation, EIC. If it's minor works, we're coming off an existing circuit and we're adding, we can do a minor works. Now that's to cover BS 7671. Really straightforward. But in addition to that, when we install smoke alarm systems, we work into 5839 Part 6, okay? And there are requirements on design, install, commissioning, and maintenance. You know, there's a criteria, and all these documents will have model forms. So if you go to Part 6, you go to Annex E, it will give you Figure E.1 will give you the model form. Now I think these model forms are crap. They don't provide enough detail, but obviously it's real basic. I create my own, but most of the electrical software apps and desktop apps and what have you will have some form of domestic fire alarm system certification. So what we're looking for on this certification is what is the design, what is the grade, the category, and what areas are we covering. So we've got a record, we're keeping a record of what's been installed. So when I turn up and I go, this system is not fit for purpose, I want to be looking at the design information. Who designed this? Who's responsible for the design? Who's responsible for the installation? Who commissioned this? So that we've got that documentation there. And like anything, it's about keeping a record. You can't just install smoke detectors, take a photo and go, oh, you've got them. How's it been designed? These systems are, they're more complicated than what people may believe. It's not just a case of installing a smoke detector on the ceiling and that's that, it works. No, we've got to measure the level of risk, and depending on the risk, what do we do to mitigate that if there were a fire? How do we get people out of the building? Fire safety is a broad topic. It's just not this black and white one size fits all. So it's really important to have certification here. So if you're installing smoke detectors, first of all, I'll say this again, if you're installing smoke detectors, I think you need to be completely aware of the British standards, Part 6 of the British standards. What's involved? What do I have to do? The little bits, the little nitty gritty ins and outs. If you don't know the standards, you shouldn't be doing it. You should be getting somebody else, a fire specialist in. Honestly, and in domestic, obviously we know that doesn't happen because people just whack detectors up like there's no business. But if there were a fire, there will be a paper trace. If somebody died or the building got damaged, there'll be a paper trace, and who do we blame? Who do we point the finger at? And you might be that as the installer. So there's some ideas here on certification, the model forms. You can adapt, like I do my own simply because I don't think there's anything good enough out there. So I create my own documentation. So yeah, so in addition of your BS 7671 certification, you should be doing a Part 6 certification as well. And also reports if you're doing maintenance. You know, read the standards, guys. It's not a big document and it lists it all out. Question 9, can you mix different brands of smoke alarms? Well, this is another question by Mr. G actually. For any manufacturer, when searching for specific products, there is generally a wide range. It can be confusing to decide what is compatible with what. This is not a question for you to answer, but perhaps you could give a view and opinion of what to aim for. If I go into a domestic situation and suggest they upgrade everything, the price alone will put them off. I need a strategy. Upgrading one to a wireless would enable another upgrade later to enhance protection. Domestic is driven by price, quality, benefit. Your advice would be a benefit. In the end, it's about doing the right thing for the right protection. Right, okay, so this whole domestic is driven by price, quality, benefit. Now, I am very blunt with my clients. People come to me because I'm a professional in this field. So you come to me and I say, this is how much it costs. Now, I'm not the cheapest in the world. Of course not. I'm also not a complete rip-off merchant either. I give very good value for money. You come to me, I give you a solution. I take cost into consideration, of course we do. But I say, you want a system, this is what it is. You know, there are different options. We can do radio interlinked. We can do hardwired interlinked, so the cost may vary, you know, the total package of what you're installing plus making good. But generally speaking, I don't give a flying monkeys about doing things, you know, scraping a barrel and it's all about price. I don't do that. And I am fortunate people come to me, but be the professional, know what you're talking about. And this is about saving people's lives. I put it really simply. Not all smoke detectors will activate efficiently if there were a fire in a part of the building and wake your sleeping baby and yourselves, like your family in this house. Most deaths from fire are from home fires, right? So smoke detectors are so important. Now, I will go into this in another video, but the smoke and carbon monoxide regulations are a load of bollocks, because basically it says you put a smoke on each level and a carbon monoxide with a solid fuel burning appliance, which is crap. That contradicts what BS 5839 Part 6 says, because we've gone through some of the design criteria and what you install. So in answer to your question, can you mix brands? Now, if it ever comes to mixing a brand and saying compatibility, I'd always go to the manufacturer and say, is this model compatible with this model? Likely is they're going to say no, okay? Because why would a manufacturer want to mix brands, right? We want to sell a whole system. I usually would suggest we go in, we replace everything so it's for new. So we've got an asset register of when everything was installed. We know when everything's going to expire, because it's electronic equipment, it don't last forever. And we can maintain that. We have a maintenance plan and schedule into place because we want to save people's lives. I don't want to work for people who just want to look at, let's tick the box for building compliance or whatever. I want to do things properly. And people come to me for that reason, that I install a fit for purpose system that's going to save their life in the event of a fire. So I personally, if I go into a property and they want to scrape straight away, I'm like, you are not for me. You're not my client. Okay? I'm not doing that. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in trying to find out the cheapest of the cheapest of the cheapest way. Yes, we give good value for money. But generally speaking, these detectors have a lifespan. We want them to last as long as possible. But I would say that the strategy when going in is that, look, I know this costs a lot of money. It is a grudge purchase, but it's here to save your life. The system we install is a good system. It's going to last. It's got warranty. My work, we provide a labour guarantee on the work installed as well. So it gives you peace of mind that should there be a fire. There's so many articles online about house fires that you can share, honestly. It can happen at any time. An appliance can catch on fire. You might have a fire from an adjacent building that's outside of your control. It happens. This is about protecting our families, protecting our homes, and we want to get out. People who think a fire will never happen to them are stupid, because it's potential. There is potential there. Yeah, and it's about assessing the risk, but it can happen to literally anybody. So I go in very hard with, this is legislation, this is the guidance, this is what experts have come together and said, this is what's recommended for this type of building. Use table 1 as an example of the standards. I hope that answers your question anyway. Right, next question, question 10. Do HMOs need fire alarm systems? This is by Chris Norris. Hi Dan, currently testing an HMO. I've noticed that there isn't form of fire or heat detection within the main areas or within the flats. What's your thoughts on this situation? And I said, where is the detection? Just hallways and landings? And he said, no, absolutely nothing in the whole building. And this is an HMO. Well, let's go to part 6, clause 9, choice of system. It tells you about what system you should install, different properties. In an HMO divided into a number of separate units or of accommodation, there might not be the same degree of compartmentation as in a purpose-built block of flats, as it is impossible to control occupants' activities and there is no overall supervision of the entire premises. It is essential that all occupants are warned before a fire in any self-contained dwelling unit threatens their safety. In order to meet this objective, in all except the smallest such as HMO, so if it's a really small HMO this doesn't apply to, communal areas need to be protected by sighting detectors generally in accordance with the recommendations of 5839 Part 1, a Category L2 system. These are similar to but more onerous than the recommendations of LD2 system in Part 1, in Table 1. So long story short, HMOs, there's recommendations here as a guidance and also in Table 1 that they need a fire alarm system. And as you see here, Table 1 lists exactly the different types of HMOs and the grades and categories that they recommend. HMO, there's some additional risks there because you might have short-term tenancies. You've got multiple people living together. You can't control the activities. Yes, you would have a fire alarm system in HMO. And also for licensing for HMO, you usually have to apply for the council for a license. And part of that, different councils are slightly a bit they do differ and vary on their requirements, but each council will have a specification of what they need in terms of fire safety for an HMO applying for that license in that field. So yes, an HMO does. Right guys, I know this has dragged on a little bit. I hope it is useful as always. Thank you for watching if you made it all the way through. I know it's a long one. I really enjoy these videos though, so if there's anything else people want me to make, I will definitely consider it. I shall see you on the next video. I am creating a webinar with the E5 group on coding when you're testing and maintaining firearm systems, so please keep a lookout on that because it's going to be a good one. I'll see you soon. Bye.